Welcome to Invisible Iceberg. I'm Bernie Rayno. On today's show, Dr. Joel Myers and I share the untold story behind the assassination of President John F. Kennedy and reveal how weather may have played a major role. Plus, in our segment, What If?, we look at what John Kennedy's legacy could have been if his life was not cut short in November of 1963. And we'll share how other U.S. presidents have treated their visits to Dallas since then. It all starts now on Invisible Iceberg. Dallas, November 22nd, 1963. A young charismatic president, along with his glamorous first lady, was in town for what was planned as a short hours long trip. Rainy, overcast skies turned to a beautiful day as the motorcade wound through the city. But did a change in weather change the course of history? It's one of the fascinating stories in the book Invisible Iceberg, When Climate and Weather Shaped History. Joining me to help delve deeper into the untold story of JFK's assassination is AccuWeather founder and executive chairman and author of the book Invisible Iceberg, When Climate and Weather Shaped History, Dr. Joel Myers. The Kennedy assassination still to this day is talked about in many ways. Why is the story so fascinating, you think?
Because everyone who was alive at that time remembers where they were.
Where were you?
I was on the Penn State campus,
okay,
leaving a class. And I remember walking toward the hub, the Student Union building, and it was strange. It was an eerie quiet. I guess the president had been shot about 15 minutes before, but I didn't know. But I saw somebody in their car, apparently listening to the radio. And when I got to the Student Union building, I heard about it, and then, of course, watched TV and saw the reporting. And then about an hour later, it was reported the president had died.
It's still etched in your memory, isn't it?
It is, yes.
And can you describe what the mood was on the Penn State campus? Just what you observed at that time.
Disbelief, sorrow. It was an eerie kind of feeling. It was everybody was in shock. Now, remember, John F. Kennedy was barely elected. He ran against Nixon. It wasn't decided until noon the next day when a flurry of votes showed up in West Virginia and Illinois and put him over the top. There was questions about whether he really won or not. Nixon didn't challenge it. It was different in those days, and just accepted it. And so, but he was charismatic. It was controversial. It was the first Catholic elected. There was concern about that. That's why he picked Lyndon Johnson as his vice president to carry Texas and to counter that concern about, in those days, he would be taking orders from the Vatican and things like that. It was a different era. But he was charismatic. His wife, obviously, Jacqueline Kennedy, was very well liked. And so while he barely won, he became popular, and his speeches were awesome. He was the most charismatic president, one can say, certainly of the century. That's up for debate, but he really had a following, and his wife, of course. But actually, heading into the date of the assassination, his popularity was on the wane, and there were questions whether he would be reelected or not. But despite all that, when he was assassinated, it all changed, and everybody thought well of him because it was just a shock.
Well, why was he in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963? What was his reasoning to visit the state?
Well, it was a question whether he could carry Texas in the 1964 election, and then without it, he may not be reelected. So he was there for a brief visit and tour, and Governor Conley was in the motorcade, and he and his wife with the president and Jacqueline, and he wanted to make an appearance, and he wanted to do all he could to help carry Texas.
Well, let's get into the weather and climate. How did that set the stage for the JFK assassination?
Well, it had rained. It was raining early. When the motorcade was about to begin, skies had cleared, and of course there was a bubble top to keep the rain off. But the bubble top was not bulletproof. President Kennedy said, "Is it raining downtown?" what's the weather like there? And they came back, it's sunny here also. Of course, they didn't have the AccuWeather app in those days.
They didn't. That would have been very helpful.
Right, the radar and Minutecast and all that. But so since it was sunny downtown as well as at the airport, Kennedy said, lose the bubble top. And of course, he rode without any protection.
We're going to introduce a little politics, just a little bit. Let's say Kennedy remained president. Would Republicans like Nixon and Reagan and the Bushes have been elected Kennedy's successors as president?
Well, this is the fascinating thing for me.
Okay.
Okay, so President Kennedy was questioned whether he'd be reelected. If he wasn't, of course, the Republicans would win. But once he was assassinated, there was tremendous sympathy for Johnson, who was his vice president. And Johnson used that to get all kinds of legislation passed that would not have passed probably otherwise. The Civil Rights Bill, Medicaid, Medicare, all the social programs, what he called the Great Society. And by itself, it might have been okay, but he also escalated the Vietnam War. Kennedy was more of a fiscal conservative, probably wouldn't have spent as much. And also Kennedy, since he had been burned by the Bay of Pigs, a failed invasion of Cuba, was very skeptical of the advice he was getting from the military advisors and the generals, and he did not want to escalate the Vietnam War. And Johnson, expertise was in local politics, U.S. Politics on the social side, knew nothing about international, nothing about military strategy and so on. And so he took the advice of his generals and escalated the Vietnam War, and that sowed his demise. He was very popular, got all these things passed in a couple of years after the assassination, but by 1968, there was all kind of demonstrations against the Vietnam War. He could have run again because you can serve 2 terms of being elected. So the year and a half he was president as vice president didn't count. So he could have run in 68, but he was so unpopular by then because of the Vietnam War, he just chose not to run and died several years later. And so Nixon came back from the dead, so to speak. Nobody thought he had, and won the election. And if you look at it, except for Jimmy Carter, who was a one-term president and only got elected probably because of the Watergate, the Republicans might have been in the White House for 24 straight years until Bill Clinton got elected.
All right, thanks, Joe. We'll talk to you in a few minutes as we go over some of the what-if scenarios relating to this tragedy. President John F. Kennedy was shot from a window at the Texas School Book Depository. The 6th-floor museum at Dealey Plaza is located there today. To give us a little more perspective on the Kennedy assassination is the museum curator, Stephen Fagan. Stephen, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
There's been much discussion about the limousine's bubble top, if it was on. Was that bulletproof?
It was not, actually. It was just a plain plexiglass inclement weather top for that vehicle. It was about 6 sections of clear plastic that snapped together on the top of the car, and then there was an optional canvas cover that could go over that. But it was not bulletproof or even bullet resistant.
So it would have probably offered little protection to the president anyway.
Certainly, I mean, it could have possibly deflected a bullet slightly. More significantly, though, there was widespread belief, really right up to the present day, that it was a bulletproof cover. So if an assassin or assassins were lying in wait for the president and saw this plexiglass cover on the car, it might have influenced whether or not they even risked taking the shot if they assumed it was bulletproof.
Why can't this similar tragedy occur today?
These days, and in recent memory, you simply don't have a presidential parade route published in the newspapers and promoted ahead of time. Now, when the president comes in and out of a city for an event, it's a bulletproof vehicle, dark windows, no announcement of the route being taken, streets closed off ahead of time.
And a lot of people I know that have visited Dealey Plaza, they always tell me how surprised they are how small it is.
Just because of the magnitude of the event that took place here, there is this expectation that Dealey Plaza is going to be this enormous, vast environment. But really, world history can change in a small geographic spot like Dealey Plaza, just like it can at Independence Hall or at Gettysburg. There are these sites where you can point to a spot and say world history changed right here on this site.
Has any other president visited or driven through Dealey Plaza since 1963?
That's a question that we actually get asked quite often. You'd be surprised, but to our knowledge, no. I mean, the Secret Service, they don't always reveal the routes that a president would take, even after the fact, after a visit to the city. But our understanding is that no president has ever passed through Dealey Plaza since 1963, whether that is simply because of the route selected or a deliberate choice, I do not know.
Stephen Fagan, curator of the 6th floor museum at Dealey Plaza. Thank you again for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Invisible Iceberg returns after a quick break. Welcome back. It's time for our segment, What If?, where we look at what President Kennedy's legacy might have been if his life had not been so tragically cut short in November 1963. Joining me again is AccuWeather founder and executive chairman and author of the book, Invisible Iceberg, When Climate and Weather Shaped History, Dr. Joel Myers. This really is one of my favorite segments of this show because when we look at these events, there's always things, one or two things that could have changed. Let's kind of delve into this. Let's say Kennedy would have remained president, and we talked about this a little bit. Would he have escalated U.S. involvement in Vietnam the way in which Johnson did?
Probably not. It's up to
speculation.
It's speculation.
But
It's all
the
speculation.
evidence does point that way, doesn't it?
It does, and it's up to the historians and the people who really study this and so on to have the final word, if you can. But it comes down to what really drives. Is it people or is it events? And this is the debate that always occurs, are how much of an impact the leaders have and how much is events. But it appears Kennedy was more conservative fiscally than Johnson. Kennedy was very wary of foreign involvements. Johnson took the advice of his generals. And so, in all likelihood, it would have been a different outcome. Also, because of the assassination and the sympathy toward what Kennedy was pushing, a lot of legislation got passed. Johnson was able to get passed because he was a masterful leader in the Senate, and now he was able to use that past experience, and as President of the United States, got all kinds of legislation passed, which was expensive, but also the basis of social programs and so on, that wouldn't have gotten passed in all likelihood if Kennedy was trying to get it through, even if he was reelected.
So you're thinking, even though Kennedy was so charismatic, from a policies and economic legislation and the civil rights legislation, you believe that it may have not been as easy to pass if he would have been alive? Is that what you think?
I think something would have passed, but they would have been less dramatic, probably more compromised. And he was more fiscally conservative. I don't think he would have pushed for as much as Johnson got through. And of course, the negative part of that is the inflation, which resulted from so much deficit spending, which led to high interest rates, which always follows. Interest rates went sky high. People couldn't afford mortgages and so on. So it was really a negative period that lasted for nearly 2 decades. Well,
let's get into the economy part of this. Let's say Kennedy had not been assassinated and remained president. We talked about the deficit inflation, the stagflation, and the problems that we had. Do you think that would have, any thought on if that would have still occurred, if he was still president and Johnson was not?
Well, it's all speculation.
It is.
And it's also, could the people, whoever, if it was more than just Oswald acting alone.
Right.
If it was the CIA, or if it was a foreign power, remember his brother was going after the unions, which were very powerful at that time. Also, there were other forces that didn't like what he was doing, and so internally and externally. So maybe there would be another attempt on his life. Who knows? And of course, the whole situation was made worse by the assassination of his brother, who might have become president in '68 after Johnson bowed out. And of course, Martin Luther King Jr. being assassinated created all kinds of turmoil. All these things happening within a matter of a few years, with the Vietnam War and the protests and people going to Canada to escape the draft. And it was a period of division of families. It's likely that all that would not have happened.
And with that, if he would have, of course, escaped assassination, could have been a second term.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Because the incumbent always has the advantage, even
right.
though his popularity has been declining in the year in 1963.
Yeah.
It still was above 50%, and it still was probably a little above where it was before he got elected. So in all likelihood, he would have been reelected in a narrow margin.
And then there would have been even greater. What happened in the decades following could have been a far different period, couldn't it?
Far different. Yeah.
And in not only from the economy, but even other aspects of American life.
Yes. Yeah.
No question.
Well, Nixon may not have been elected. Who would have, he came out, he had been defeated for president. He was defeated, tried to run for the governor of California in 1962, and he comes back and becomes president. And then there was Watergate, and that was more turmoil, so it was not a good time.
And we went into such a pessimistic mood during that time frame, and you just wonder from even from a larger overall picture of American life, how much changed that day.
Yes.
It's incredible. And again, it begins with one weather event that shaped the history for decades.
Yeah, if it had rained, if the rain
If
had
it would have been lasted
the
just a
bubble
little
top would have been on. Oswald may not have taken the shot. If he did, he might have missed, and it would have been. It could have been all very different.
It could have been all very different. And as we look forward to even his legacy, it could have been even greater legacy than what it is now, because he's still known as one of the more popular presidents in U.S. history, correct?
Well, he was very charismatic.
Yeah.
His wife, Jacqueline Kennedy, became, one of the most popular people in the country. But part of that results, unfortunately, from you being assassinated.
Yeah.
That's part of the
overall story.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating story, and I can't wait to get into more stories here as we continue to delve into these stories. The more and more you read the book, the more and more you learn. And as always, weather and climate shapes a lot.
It does.
Thanks, Dr. Joe Myers. Many feel this tragic event is when America lost its innocence. Up next, we go a little deeper into how it also changed the course of our country, even to this day. We'll be back with more after the break. Welcome back to Invisible Iceberg. I'm Bernie Rayno. The JFK assassination was the first moment in a challenging next decade for the country. When Lyndon Johnson became president, he used JFK's legacy to get the Civil Rights Act of 1964 quickly passed. Although the new law made race-based discrimination illegal, progress proved difficult. After winning re-election in 1964, President Johnson escalated the Vietnam War dramatically, which led to mass protests and disillusionment with government. Although Johnson's general kept telling him we were on the verge of winning, the 1968 Tet Offensive made it clear that we were nowhere close. In a televised speech in March of 1968, Johnson announced that he was pausing the bombing of Vietnam to allow peace talks to proceed, and then surprised the nation when he also said that he was not a candidate for another term as president. JFK's brother, Robert Kennedy, gained support after he calmed the nation following the tragic assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in April. He entered the presidential race and became the frontrunner upon winning the California primary in June. Tragically, Robert Kennedy was assassinated that night, leaving Vice President Hubert Humphrey as the Democratic nominee, which then led to Richard Nixon's election. The Nixon administration would later become entangled in the Watergate scandal, eventually leading to his resignation. I want to thank AccuWeather founder and executive chairman and author of the book Invisible Iceberg, When Climate and Weather Shaped History, Dr. Joe Myers, for joining us today. And a big thanks to all of you for watching. If you have a question or comment, send us an email at questions@AccuWeather.com. We look forward to seeing you next time.